Good afternoon. Thank you for joining INSA for Wednesday Wisdom with the Honorable Isabel Patelunas. Please welcome INSA Vice President for Policy, Larry Hanower.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for INSA's virtual speaker series. We're pleased to host the Honorable Isabel Patelunas, the Assistant Secretary of Treasury for Intelligence and Analysis. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few housekeeping notes. We hope to make this as interactive as possible, so if you have questions, please submit them through the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Also, as a reminder, this program is on the record. The event is open to the public, and we're pleased to welcome members of the press to the call today. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker. Izzy Patelunas has served as the Treasury Department's top intelligence official since September 2018. Ms. Patelunas is an accomplished member of the Senior Intelligence Service, having served in a variety of senior management positions, including Director of the President's Daily Brief Staff at ODNI, Deputy Director of Middle East and North Africa Analysis at CIA, and Director of CIA's Advanced Analysis Training Program. Izzy, welcome to INSA.
Thank you so much, Larry. I'm really pleased to be able to join you. I think INSA has a great mission. I feel fortunate to have had the opportunities to have served in my career and to have worked with so many committed public servants. So thank you to INSA for the important role that you play in bringing together a wonderful community of interest.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us and sharing your insights with us today. So for those who aren't familiar with Treasury's Office of Intelligence and Analysis, which is a relatively small component in the intelligence community, can you start by describing the organization's missions and roles in the intelligence community?
Certainly. So again, as you mentioned, OIA is small, but we think of ourselves as mighty. We are Treasury's intelligence component. We are the only finance ministry in the world that houses its own intelligence component, and we're very proud of that. And then we perform all of the regular functions that happen in intelligence. So we're not just about analysis. We're probably better known for our analysis, but we have we process all security adjudications. We operate secure systems, so our IT infrastructure, and then of course we drive intelligence requirements.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, in a previous life, when I worked on the House Intelligence Committee, one of my responsibilities was overseeing Treasury OIA's programs and budgets. And I always thought that the organization punched far above its weight and accomplished a great deal with relatively few personnel and resources. So kudos to you and to your staff. But now Treasury is just the latest organization that you've served in over a long intelligence career. You've served as a senior manager at CIA, at ODNI, and now at Treasury. So what enables you to be an effective leader in different organizations that have different organizational cultures?
So you put up my top 11 guidelines for leaders. It's not a list that I sat down and wrote one day. My leadership philosophy has really evolved over the 31, I hate when I say 31 years, but 31 years as an intelligence professional. And I think if I broke it down into broad categories, I've really thought about leading in three different ways. The first and most important thing is that you have to become an expert in whatever job you're in, from, you know, a GS9 when I started my career to an SES. You know, if you don't develop expertise in your core area, you're going to struggle. Second is we don't do any of this alone. Find a good mentor or find several good mentors. I have been so fortunate to have had dozens of mentors during my career, and I feel now really strongly about paying that back. And I take lots of opportunities to mentor both formally and informally. And then the third bucket is as your skills grow. So you don't want to do this when you're brand new in a position, but get involved in corporate initiatives. It makes your workplace better, and it also broadens your perspective. But again, I put my 11, guidelines for being a leader, and I can maybe hone in on a couple.
Sure.
My favorite is keep a sense of humor. every staff that I ever start on, I usually say, listen, if I don't get one good belly laugh a day, I really feel like my day is incomplete. And I find those people who can make me laugh, because a lot of things that we deal with, either they're very serious, from the substance that we're looking at, a lot of bad actors in the world, and or we're dealing with difficult personnel issues. And so I think finding a way to take our work deadly seriously, but don't take ourselves too seriously. And then all feedback is a gift. I probably say that once a week. Again, we get a lot of feedback from bosses, from peers, from those who work for us. And if we don't take that feedback seriously, we're missing an opportunity to meet someone where they are, to make an improvement in what we do. So again, those are just two that I'd highlight.
Those are great. And if for those of you watching, if you want to download Izzy's guidelines for leaders, you'll see in the right-hand side of your screen, there are some documents, some handouts, some information about INSA, as well as a copy of the slides. So if you want these for reference, especially the point about having a sense of humor, which I think is critical, then you can download those there. Now, I wanted to ask you about one previous role you had. You've served as the director of the President's Daily Brief staff, developing analyses of world events that go directly to the president and to other top U.S. policymakers. But how do the intelligence needs of officials at this senior-most level of government differ from those of officials who are further down the chain, maybe the first-line policymakers? And how do analysts present information differently to these really senior officials?
Well, if I had to boil it down to the simplest answer, I would say be concise.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'll expand on that because that's too concise of an answer. But my time as the PDB director really reinforced, and then my current position maybe even more so, that we think that the analysis that we're working on is the most important thing that any policymaker needs to read. But guess what? They are confronted with lots of things, not just national security decisions, but a host of different urgent messages from a host of different actors throughout the world. And so we need to make sure that we are giving them the simplest, clearest, most direct, and most compelling possible responses. I think you notice that more when you give someone, muddled analysis, and they can't even understand what the message is, let alone what they're supposed to take away from it. We don't give them enough evidence to be able to support a judgment. We end up losing the confidence of seniors, and that can cost us a customer or an opportunity to influence or support a decision. And so I think making sure that we're concise is really important. I know analysts have a lot of information that they want to convey, but for the most part, seniors trust us to have done our homework, and you have to give them just enough information to prove that we've done our homework. I make two exceptions to that. One is when it's a crucial judgment. Perhaps it's something that will influence a decision to, for an attack plan or to go to war, or something that's vitally important. Then you get a little bit more space and you better provide a lot more context for your response. And the second is when we're changing a judgment. I think our customers understand that either world events change or new reporting comes in, and sometimes our judgments change, but we do owe the customer a thorough reason for why we've changed a judgment.
Makes sense. And you see on the slide there on the screen that please do ask questions. We're happy to take questions from the audience. There's a box on the right-hand side of your screen for you to submit questions to us, and I'll go through them, and hopefully we'll get to as many as possible. So we do have one audience question that's somewhat of a follow-up from what we were just talking about. Kenzie Leach from NGA asks a question about presenting analysis. Basically, that senior political appointees from either party approach policy issues with perspectives that may be shaped by politics. So as a professional intelligence analyst, how do you maintain your objectivity when briefing someone, an official who's taking that kind of perspective?
So this is a really important question. So thank you for asking it. And it's not an easy response. But I think, first of all, as senior managers, we have to create the environment where we can talk about how important it is to have objectivity and integrity. And there, it's kind of an awkward conversation to have. You don't just walk up to an, hey, are you being objective and having integrity today? But we need to make sure that we're having those conversations frequently so people understand. Requires constant vigilance. And then there's a lot of different ways when you're providing that intelligence to ask questions beforehand. And the questions that I came up with is, first, have we fully weighed all of the evidence that's available? Have we considered all options? You know, sometimes you can paint a one-sided story. Is there a part of the story that I'm not telling? This is a tricky one. Am I using emotive words that would put some emotion behind the argument that I'm making? We need to remove those emotive words. Do I need to state a confidence level in this judgment? Is it so important? Or am I misleading someone by not saying this is a low confidence judgment because, right? If it's a high confidence, or is it a high confidence judgment because? Again, these are all dependent on the kinds of analyses that you're putting in front of the customer. Sometimes if it's that important of a judgment, ask an outside reader who's not familiar with it to read it and make sure they can't pick up any bias in it. Are you being clear about the sourcing that you're using? You know, are you using a source that maybe isn't as compelling, and you need to make sure that you're being clear? Or, you know, is the source of the information, you know, trying to influence as well as inform? And then the last thing, again, every good analyst, when they go to the Kent School, for example, when I worked there, we learn how to apply structured analytic techniques. And there are several that will be really helpful in helping you to check for biases. So those are, I think, some really good ways to approach that. I will say that I think analysts should be careful about not settling for the lowest common denominator. What I mean is you know, you can only agree because you have to take all of the meat out of your judgment. Our customers value dissent. When I was over on the PDB, I do remember quite a few times where our briefers got feedback about how much a dissent was valued because it allowed a customer to see two sides of the argument and the information that supported that judgment. So I think that's the way that I'll respond to that.
Great. No, that's great. The training is obviously really critical because it gives people the confidence and the skills to be objective. One other question we have about analysis is how does your office deal with open source information? There's a great deal of open source information out there. How do you work with that in your analysis, particularly on financial issues and related topics?
Well, again, we're really fortunate to have quite a bit of open source information. And as much of my workforce is currently teleworking, they are spending a great deal of time doing research on open source information. Because we have access to wider than just open source, we will incorporate it into our analysis. But we wouldn't be all source if we didn't really push to see what's available out there. And a lot of times what's out there is big data, right? And so then the beauty of big data is making sure that we have the right tools put on top of that data to be able to make some sense of it and then incorporate it into our analysis.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about some of the threats and some of the challenges that your office looks at. Your staff, the Treasury's intelligence staff, came to prominence in particular after the 9/11 attacks, when following terrorists' money movements was seen as a critical way to understand and undermine their networks. And of course, the same follow the money techniques are useful to combating proliferation, drug trafficking, official corruption, and other transnational criminal activities. So we have a question from Roy Horton of Noblesse and Marianne Brogdale of Mission Essential, who both asked essentially the same question: what are the principal financial challenges to U.S. national security? And then I'll add to that, is countering terror financing still a top challenge for your office and for the nation?
So yes to the latter, but to the the first question, the U.S. has the largest, most sophisticated financial system in the world. So that's great, but what makes our system so attractive to investors and global companies, unfortunately, also makes it attractive to our adversaries. So protecting the U.S. financial system from exploitation from anyone, from anybody from terrorists to corrupt foreign officials to malicious cyber actors or hostile foreign governments, is our most important challenge.
Makes sense. But now, the U.S. has had sanctions on countries like North Korea, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, others for quite a long time. And yet those sanctions haven't really seemed to have changed the regime's behavior or contributed to significant political reforms. So what impacts, as you look at some of the threats to the U.S., what impacts have sanctions had on U.S. adversaries? And in a related question from Ricky Elliott, how do countries use cryptocurrencies to evade sanctions? And what can we do about that?
Okay, so I'll say sanctions almost certainly have had an effect on regime decision making, but sanctions are just one of many tools that the U.S. government has. So sanctions are just part of a whole of government approach to all of the national security challenges that we face. Importantly, changing regime behavior is not the only benefit from a sanctions regime. The U.S. benefits when it becomes more difficult for our adversaries to operate in the international financial system, and we've seen many cases where it's created those conditions. It's almost certainly more difficult for some of those bad actors to operate in the international financial system. And again, you just have to open up the newspaper or go online, and you see examples of that every day, of regimes complaining of their inability to access the system. And then I'll sort of close by saying financial warfare is not like kinetic warfare. You can't get a bomb damage assessment 24 hours later to see if you destroy the target. Financial warfare requires patience and resolve, and I will tell you that our team in OIA is relentless. So we will continue at it. And again, the evaluations are, sometimes it's in the strength of an economy and whether or not we've seen negative impacts on the economy rather than regime behavior. And then that almost certainly influences regime behavior. The second question was on cryptocurrencies.
Cryptocurrencies, right. So how non-state actors and state actors might be using cryptocurrencies in order to get around sanctions. And we have a second question related to that from Christopher Williams on how much of your time you spend looking at things like cryptocurrency.
So I don't want to get too specific, but again, cryptocurrency is certainly a growing issue and a growing threat because of the supposed anonymity of a lot of these systems. Bad actors think it's a great way to be able to do business and hide it from the US government and others who are watching. Again, a lot of times they're not hiding from us. They're just trying to hide very broadly from any legal
Someone
system.
else, yeah.
Yes. And so we do see it a lot, but so how much time do we spend on it? I can't do a quantitative on that, but I will tell you that we certainly are spending a lot more time looking at cryptocurrencies, who's interested in them, national digital currencies, who's interested in national digital currencies. So that's from a state actor perspective. And then from a malign actor, what cryptocurrencies are they interested in and what kinds of successes? Sometimes, the complicating factor in cryptocurrencies also makes it harder sometimes for bad actors like terrorists, for instance, to be able to easily make payments and move money. And so sometimes the beauty of cryptocurrency also works against some of the bad actors. So it's here to stay. and we will continue to look at it very closely.
We need to understand it, yeah.
Right.
So that leads to a question about non-state actors. And in particular, what kind of impact has the pandemic had on some of the threat actors you follow? I mean, maybe state actors, but also non-state actors. And do you see non-state actors adjusting to the new reality in the pandemic in ways that are different from state actors' measures?
That's a good question. I think that can easily be answered by again, what we see in the open press.
Mm-hmm.
The sad part of the pandemic is everyone is affected. Perhaps the tiny silver lining, and very tiny, is that some of the malign actors are struggling with things, you know, particularly transnational criminal organizations, you know, they're
Right.
struggling with some of their efforts. And so, you know, if we are going to have a positive about something that's so horribly negative, you know, everybody's equally affected.
And does whatever measures they have to take during the pandemic make it easier to detect potentially illicit activity? Do activities stand out more?
I don't know that they stand out more. I think in some cases we're seeing slowdowns in things because it's just more challenging. But I think in other instances, you know, we're seeing perhaps cyber actors trying to take advantage of lots of people working at home or doing what we're doing right now, right? Being online. So there's
Right.
there are a lot of facets to this that make it both complicated, and so it's not an easy answer. And I'm not going to get into specifics, but it certainly has. I'm not going to say it's made our job easier, but it certainly, you can read about it maybe more easily because you can see it in the press.
Sure, makes sense. One other threat I wanted to ask you about, because INSA's done some work on it. So INSA recently published a white paper on the threat of trade-based money laundering, basically smuggling of different products that enables criminals and corrupt foreign officials to earn and transfer several billions of dollars a year. So I wanted to ask, how significant a threat do you think trade-based money laundering is to U.S. national interests? And then in a related question, Tim Kapsapsis of Previse LLC, who's clearly read INSA's paper, so thank you very much, Tim. He notes that INSA had recommended in this paper that the government establish a trade-based money laundering fusion center so product manufacturers whose goods are smuggled can share information more proactively with intelligence and law enforcement agencies. So is this feasible, Tim asks? And if so, how can the community work more closely with industry?
So I read the paper too. As soon as I
Good,
saw
thank you.
potential, and I saw some references to OIA in there. It's a huge part of what we do, right? Because it's a enormous problem, and it's not just for criminals and corrupt foreign officials, but sanctions evaders, right? And that's a big part of what we're looking at for trade-based money laundering, is that there's a sanctions evasions, a big chunk of sanctions evaders. So we continue to see it as a big threat. As for the fusion center, it would be in some ways, so it's a great idea. I am very big on the idea of piloting a lot of different things to see how we can get traction. And broadly, the threat finance world, which is the analytic world that we broadly characterize our work under, it's not a huge community, and sometimes it's a little bit misunderstood. And so I am very big on making sure that there's different ways that we're always partnering with other organizations. First, we're small, so we have to partner. Second, I think your research and your production is always stronger when you do partner, because you get that other perspective. Maybe another organization is operating under slightly different authorities, so they can approach things in a different way, or they have different and more unique data sources that you can share and pull together. So, I mean, if that's the ultimate goal of what you're referring to as a fusion center, then there are lots of ways to accomplish a lot of those parts of the mission, and maybe not formalize it, because I think,
Right.
so this is just, I'm answering this very off the cuff, but sometimes when we create these additional centers or cells, they become, pretty quickly, they become part of the mainstream, and we then lose that great ability to be flexible, which is what the beauty of what building something like that gives us in the first place.
Right. So the benefit is maybe creating a process, if not a center, a process for sharing information more proactively with manufacturers of goods that get smuggled, like cigarettes or alcohol or whatnot.
Right. And I think sometimes recognizing the centers of excellence, right? So if you know which unit is the center of excellence, then you find ways to partner with them on some of those issues. And I think it creates a little bit more energy around it, but you then don't have to actually move resources. You're just moving focus, right?
Right. So since we're talking about partnering, let me ask you some questions about collaboration with the financial sector. Financial institutions have long said that they need access to intelligence and law enforcement information so that they can do their part to crack down on terrorists, money launderers, criminals, and others moving money illicitly, as well as to defend themselves from cyber attacks. So how does your office share information with the banking sector? And are the processes that exist for collaboration already, are they sufficient to combat those threats?
Well, we have a very active program. The Secretary is charged with protecting the U.S. financial sector. So, you know, it's a core part of our mission. One place that I think we have a great public-private collaboration is with the, I never know what it stands for, Financial Systemic Analysis and Resilience Center, FSR. It's just
FSR, right.
And we have a great relationship with them in helping to make sure that we're mutually sharing threat information and concerns, and we do it in a pretty quick way, because again, you never want to say, oh, well, we'll only share every 2 weeks, because then you miss the opportunity to share when there really is something that's quickly moving and fast breaking.
Right.
This isn't OIA, but our sister organization, FinCEN, shares information on illicit finance through the FinCEN exchange. And so that's a very powerful way to be able to share with the private sector. And they share dozens and dozens of advisories. So again, we're always working to get better in this space. I'm not saying that it's perfect, but I think we continue to make a lot of improvements in the area, and I think we're doing pretty well.
Good. Okay. Now, there's another piece of this collaboration, and that's the people in the organization. Now, most Treasury intelligence analysts are intelligence professionals, and so they haven't really worked in the banking sector. And similarly, most bank officials have risen through the private sector and have never worked in the intelligence community. But the public and private sector need to collaborate on all these different threats. So how do you ensure that your staff has an effective understanding of how international banking works? And how can you help financial institutions better understand what information the intelligence community can provide and can't provide?
That's a great question. We have several, a dozen or so folks who actually have worked and have had long careers in the banking sector. And so that's really helpful to us. And those folks who come on board really help us to better understand in a more granular way. I think OIA's training program helps us to understand in broad sweeps, but I think sometimes only working in the industry do you really understand the day-to-day, threats and concerns. And so part of our training program is actually bringing people in, aside from relying on those who have already worked there, is bringing people in from the banking sector to talk to us in a pretty granular way about where there are concerns and helping us to develop requirements that help us to refine the kinds of collection that we do. So I think the program we have in place makes us pretty good at what we do. We're always looking for ways to make sure that people have the information they had. I think while folks have been on telework, we've really expanded our ability, because when our folks are on telework, they're doing all kinds of self-development and really
Right.
enriching your understanding. So maybe we'll be even better when we finally return from the pandemic.
Right. It's a good opportunity for some training. In fact, maybe some of your staff is watching this and learning a few things too. Let me ask about another partner that your office collaborates with, industry. INSA, of course, is an industry organization. So how some of our members would like to know how your office currently partners with industry and how industry can enhance its support to your organization.
So I always fall back on OIA is very small. From a contractual perspective, we don't have a whole lot of contracts, but we're trying to develop some outside expert SME type contracts. But primarily for us, it's growing our ability to work in the cloud, growing our ability to work tools. Again, big data is our life. Financial data is the crown jewel that really helps to set OIA apart in the niche analysis that we're able to do. And so working with industry to make sure that we have the best tools to really look at that data. And, you know, we're trying out lots of different kinds of tools all the time to see how effective they are for us.
Good. I'm glad you mentioned big data and the cloud because we have questions from our audience about both. Mark Hopman with NGA asks, what long-term strategic applications of artificial intelligence do you envision in the IC?
Well, we will not be a leader in that because that's just, we will probably be a follower. I suspect that NGA is a little bit further ahead on that than we are. But I will say from my time at CIA that artificial intelligence can do things for you, training the tools to look for things that you don't even know to look for so that they can run continuously through a set of data is probably that's about as far as we've gone with artificial intelligence, so that there's a script running in the background all the time that's constantly trying to help you with new insights that a human being could never come up with in you know, spending any kind of time with the data.
Right.
But we would aspire for then, if we had more resources.
Yeah, it all comes down to resources, but there's a lot presumably that all of us need to do with AI with whatever resources we have. Now on the cloud, Jared Gazarek of HashiCorp asked, what is your office doing to operate more effectively in the cloud?
So we are just starting a hybrid program where we have some information that we're going to be starting to put on the classified cloud. Again, we are not a resource-rich part of the intelligence community. And if I could share, which I can't, you know, how minuscule our budget is, it would end up, I usually make it in classified settings, the butt of a joke for how small our resources are. But we are, in fact, in our 2020 and 2021, we put a substantial amount for us into moving us so that we build a hybrid. And I think most of the intelligence community is in a hybrid. Nobody has everything in the cloud. So we're moving in that direction.
Okay.
And excited about it.
Well, that's the direction that I think most organizations are going in. And so again, within resource constraints, we all have to figure out how to operate more effectively. So we have two questions about pandemic-related issues. One is how did OIA contribute to understanding what was happening to the financial system at the outset of the COVID-19 crisis? And then related issues, how have you managed staffing your office during the pandemic, given the need to work in a classified space and given that you're in a 185-year-old building that makes social distancing hard?
So the first question, well, maybe the two are interrelated. Because we're on the White House compound, we did have to go down to a very small number. And so we were, at a fraction of a percentage of our normal workforce. And it made it difficult. But as far as how the pandemic was affecting the international financial sector, we worked closely with international affairs here at Treasury. So they have a full suite of views into the unclassified world of the international financial sector. And so we supported them from the classified perspective in continuing to, do read books and give them briefings to make sure that they knew what we knew from the classified perspective, and it supported their work in that way.
Okay. Can I assume you're still working on pandemic-related issues since the financial system is still all challenged?
I think we were looking at that for a very long time. I suspect, we'll be doing some backward-looking. What did the data tell us?
Mm-hmm.
And now, because it's a little hard for everyone to know forward-looking where we might end up. You can do scenarios analysis for where things may go, and again, look at specific countries and what their financial shape was before the pandemic, and then try to take that forward with all of the different forces that are at play during the pandemic and do some projections forward. But a lot of it is scenarios based.
Yeah. Let me go back to a topic that we covered before, because we have an interesting question from Lee Watson in the audience. About collaboration with the financial sector. Do you have a program to clear people from financial institutions so that you can engage in a deeper level discussion on threats or responses, and then potentially build intelligence products together?
FSARC has cleared people, and then there are some in the financial sector who are cleared, and we share information with them regularly. It's not all classified that we share with them, but we do share classified information as appropriate. And especially if it's threat reporting, that we make sure we get to them very, very quickly.
Mm-hmm. And does the process for clearing people in the financial sector, does that work effectively? Because we know that banks they often say they need more cleared people, and that it takes a long time. Do you think that works effectively, or is that not really Treasury's responsibility?
Well, I will say that it takes a long time to clear anyone for the U.S. government. So we don't single out anyone for how long it takes to get a clearance. So the answer is yes, it generally takes a long time. Again, if you've talked to DOD, who's taken over the clearance process, I think we're on a much better trajectory. But again, that's not specific to the financial sector.
Right, makes sense. I want to go back to another technical issue. We have a question from Joseph Boot, who asks how you balance analyst experience and judgments with machine-derived analytics, and how can we build a trusted human-machine interaction where both sides of the equation are valued and make contributions in a world of big data?
That's a really good question. I think first we have to get analysts and managers up to sort of a baseline understanding of data and data analytics. I think so many people, and I'll say people who came in 30 years ago when there was no data analytics, or it was a very, very small field for a very few specialized folks. And so there are some really good classes out there that teach managers how to be comfortable with big data. Because if managers aren't encouraging their analysts to do that, I think they will, in some cases, might not be as aggressive in the area. Do I ever foresee a time where, and this wasn't the question they asked, but I'm going to change it into a different question. Do I foresee a time when an analyst would not be vital in the loop? Absolutely not. But they need to understand what the data can do for them and what the data won't do for them. And then I think visually displaying it and making it a powerful argument is really important. But in the end, and maybe because I'm a words person, right? And I've been writing for 30 years as an analyst, I think we're always going to rely on the analyst for the storytelling part. And that to me is how we really make sure that we've had some value added. You know, the graphs and figures and numbers are powerful, but the story we tell and how it connects to a broader part of the story and what it means, I think, again, you need really great analysts who can think very broadly about how to tell that story.
Right. So speaking of analysts, we have a question from John Nichols, whom I know and who has a number of interns at his organization. So I assume he's asking this on behalf of his interns and junior staff. Do you have entry-level positions in OIA, and how does a recent graduate get one of them?
So we are always posting jobs. We have 4 interns this summer. I'm very proud that for the first time, OIA has paid interns. Treasury has a long history of unpaid interns who also don't hold clearances, but we have interns who have clearances. So if you're still in college or graduate school, that's a way to get into OIA at least. We post all of our jobs on USA Jobs, and we always have a healthy number of positions that are open, both on the analytics side, counterintelligence, IT. There are always lots of options. But again, we're small, so for us, lots is dozens as opposed to perhaps hundreds in other organizations.
Right. Well, I'm sure you'll hear from some of the people who were watching, because they were probably listening to get some good tips. We're closing out on our time, but let me ask one last question before we wrap up. A question from Abraham Borum and a related question from Rachel Greenspan. Basically, if you had access to additional resources, what would you like to be able to do with them, or what would you like to accomplish with them? And what would you like to leave behind in OIA as sort of your, your principal accomplishment during your tenure there?
Well, OIA has grown for us quite a bit. Added, maybe 40 or 50 analysts and other positions in the last couple of years. What I would like my legacy, boy, talking about stumping the panelists, that was a very good question, but I have to think about how I answer it in this venue, because I can think of how I would answer it in a different venue. So I think developing an even stronger analytic cadre who, again, takes more advantage of the financial data that we have, that we share that knowledge very broadly, and that we help the rest of the intelligence community to better understand the threat finance needs. Again, I think most people have a really strong understanding of what a military analyst is looking for, what a political analyst is looking for, even what an economist is looking for. But threat finance is a really unique niche skill. And so helping collectors and even other analysts to better understand the field and help us to partner with them. And again, I think we already do a great job, so if I can strengthen some of that. And then I think in the cyber realm is the place where I spend most of my sleepless nights. Cyber keeps me up awake, so building our cyber capacity, including tools to help us do cyber even better and to detect problems even earlier, is a legacy that I would be thrilled to leave behind.
Great. Well, you certainly enlightened a lot of us today and as to what threat finance analysts and what the Treasury analysts do, and what issues are on your plate. So thank you for sharing your insights with us today. Do you have any last closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I don't know if any of my staff are online, but I just have to say that, again, I started with we're small and mighty, and I'll end with we're small and mighty. My staff has been remarkable during the pandemic, building an emergency capacity to be able to keep doing what we're doing with just a handful of folks cycling in the building, and they really have been remarkable. I couldn't be prouder of them, and I continue to be proud of how remarkable they are. And then I want to thank INSA for hosting this great forum.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us. Thank you to your staff for doing all this great work. And for those of you watching online, thank you for taking the time to join us. Just a few announcements before we close out. For those of you interested in financial intelligence and cybersecurity, which most of you probably are, I want to draw your attention to a special discussion that INSA will host on July 16th in partnership with the Bank Policy Institute. We'll examine the Cyberspace Solarium Commission's recommendations for enhancing intelligence sharing with critical infrastructure providers, with a special focus on the financial sector. Our panel will feature Congressman Jin Langevin, who's a member of the commission, Everett Jordan, who's one of Izzy's Deputy Assistant Secretaries at Treasury, Leslie Ireland, who is a member of the board at Citi, Scott DePasquale, who's president of the FSR, which we discussed earlier, and the panel will be moderated by Chris Feeney from the Bank Policy Institute. So information on how to sign up for this discussion is on INSA's website at insaonline.org. In the meantime, we hope you'll join us next week for our all-virtual event, The New IC, Empowering Women and Engaging Men. We took INSA's usual one-day event and developed a week-long offering that has keynotes from Deputy DNI Beth Sanner and former Air Force Secretary Deborah Lee James, panels with leaders from across the intelligence community, and it wraps up with an incredible Sisterhood of Spies panel featuring NGA Deputy Director Stacey Dixon, Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research Ellen McCarthy, and several others. As part of the New IC event, we'll hold a panel discussion focused on the importance of diversity and innovation in national security that is open to everyone free of charge. So please check out the INSA website for details. Registration for the event closes tomorrow, I believe. So please check that out and register soon. Finally, we've opened registration for our all-virtual annual conference, the Intelligence and National Security Summit, which will take place online September 16, 17, and 18. Details can be found online at intelsummit.org. When the webinar ends, you'll see a short survey pop up on your screen. Please take a moment to complete it and let us know how we did today so we can improve similar events in the future. So this concludes today's program. Izzy, thank you again for sharing your insights with us. And to everyone online, stay safe and healthy and have a wonderful day.